Everyone eventually comes to ask themselves this once. Did I live a good life? This question rarely visits during our younger days. When we are busy, passionate, and running forward, there is no room for such a question to squeeze in. However, at the edge of life, when you reach the place where you can no longer run, that question arrives very quietly, yet inevitably. Today, there are two elderly men. One man dedicated his entire life to having a higher position, a larger house, a thicker wallet. He faithfully followed the grammar of success demanded by the world. And finally, he held in his hands the things that grammar promised. The other man dedicated his entire life to being deeper emotions, more profound relationships, and being his truest self. He valued the invisible more than the visible. And finally, he built something within his heart that the world could never measure. Both men are now sitting in the same darkness. The door called death stands open before them. Life is asking them one final question. What were you? Faced with that question, the expressions of the two men are entirely different. Person A was someone whose direction was always clear. To him, life was one giant race. A game with a starting line, a finish line, and the winner being the one who runs faster. He never once doubted those rules. Because doubting the rules meant falling behind. He still remembers the feeling of opening his first paycheck at 25. It was a small number, but it felt like his own worth. It felt as if he grew larger as the numbers grew larger. So he devoted his entire life to increasing those numbers. Buying a better car, moving to a bigger apartment, and attaining a higher title each brought a brief moment of ecstasy. But that joy always cooled down quickly. And in its place, a new thirst invariably rushed in. He called it growth. Though, in truth, it was an addiction. Now he knows that the race he ran all his life actually had no finish line. Once a goal was achieved, a higher one appeared. Once filled, it was emptied again. Once possessed, he wanted to possess more. He knocked on the door of satisfaction all his life. But that door never once opened from the inside. On the other hand, person B's compass pointed in a different direction. He cherishes the memory of suddenly tearing up while reading a book alone one afternoon. He couldn't explain why he cried, but it felt like proof of being alive. He collected moments like those. The awe before a first-seen landscape, the honest confession shared with an old friend, the evening when a stranger's small kindness moved him unexpectedly. Those things weren't recorded in a bank book, but they were deeply engraved within him. Desire itself is not a bad thing. The problem is the direction of desire. Desire directed outward demands more and more without end. But desire directed inward makes this present moment increasingly richer. Human beings cannot live alone. So we form relationships. But the way of forming relationships is different for each person. Some try to possess relationships, and some try to share relationships. And that difference is most clearly revealed at the end of life. A liked people, sincerely. But in his love, there was always a subtle calculation. He first looked at what the other person could do for him. It wasn't a bad intention. It was just that the way he read the world was like that. The world is about giving and taking, and he believed relationships should be the same. So his relationships were clean. But they weren't deep. They didn't last long. When his title disappeared, his contacts were erased. As he grew older, the invitations to the glamorous parties also stopped. Now in his room, traces of decades spent together are hung in frames. But among the people in those photos, there is no one to hold his hand today. Love is not something to hold onto, but he realized it too late. B's relationships were different. He tried to understand the other person and did not try to possess them. Even when he thought a friend was wrong, he did not judge easily. Even if a loved one chose a different path from his, he respected that path. Rather than trying to get something from a relationship, he tried to hand something over. Sometimes it even felt like he was losing out. But now, there are people by his side. People who visit even without a special reason. People who sit beside him without saying a word. It was the quiet return of things he had bestowed throughout his life. Love cannot be possessed. However, when you let it flow, strangely, more remains. The two elderly men sit under the same moonlight tonight. In one person's eyes, there is a chill. He lived clutching tightly for fear of being robbed, but only now does he realize that eventually, he must leave everything behind. The more you have, the heavier the act of leaving becomes. Only at the very end of his life does he finally ask, "So, what was I?" In the other person's eyes, there is stillness. He didn't have much, but the feeling of having lived is permeating his whole body. That feeling cannot be taken away by death, because it was already sufficiently consumed within life, sufficiently shared, and sufficiently loved. He thinks as he closes his eyes, "I have lived." Human life is ultimately summarized by two questions. What have I had, and how have I existed? No one can answer on your behalf which one is more important. Eras, philosophies, and religions have struggled with this question for thousands of years, but the answer was ultimately left as each person's responsibility. However, one thing is clear. That answer is not completed at the moment of death, but is created by the quiet accumulation of choices in this moment today. What are you walking toward today? To have more, or to live more deeply? Perhaps these two paths are not contradictions after all. But where you place your weight will determine the room you sit in on the final night of your life. Which room do you wish to sit in? I hope you carry that question in a corner of your heart throughout this day.